Hermetica that I translated, the Kori Kazmu, I mean, it's very clear that these are Egyptian nationalists who are saying Egypt is the center of the world. The Greeks, they barely know how to speak. It's just sophistical brouhaha, puff of smoke, logistical games. We speak in the language of the gods, as it were. The real wisdom is ours. So there's definitely that national element. I mean, it's all ironical because all this stuff ends up in Greek.
Greek, and also they one of the criticisms, right, is they say that Greek lacks energeia, and there's no equivalent demonic. They're using Greek philosophical language to criticize paucity of Greek. Like there's no equivalent Egyptian term. It seems like it's an argument against the Greeks that relies on their very philosophy. They're using the master's tools to take the master's house apart.
And a great example is, but Iamblichus in De Mysteries, or basically pretends to be an Egyptian priest, and he can pull this off. But he does a brilliant job pretending to be an Egyptian priest, speaking Egyptian wisdom, which is actually, I mean, his own rendition of it.
The Demotic Book of Thoth for the first time, and when you actually read something written by Egyptian priests and you compare it to Iamblichus or the Corpus Hermeticum, to realize how wildly different they are as texts. But I do wonder about indigenous Egyptian priestly wisdom versus the importation of Greek speculative philosophy.
Our guests this evening require no introduction. Both gentlemen are providing invaluable public-facing scholarship via their respective YouTube and Patreon platforms. Although they need no introduction, it would be remiss of me not to. So first, he's the devil on the run, a six-gun lover, a candle in the wind. He is the curator and host of the channel Esoterica, the alchemical governor himself, Dr. Justin Sledge.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
Welcome. And in this corner, the reigning, defending, undisputed heavyweight champion of second century alternative Christianities, Iamblichus himself risen, Dr. Matthew David Litwa. Welcome.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Good to be
awesome. Here. So, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we are going to, in the immortal words of the band Rat, lay it down. We are talking about the Corpus Hermetica. So, gentlemen, what's the deal with Hermetism?
Basically, yeah, we're looking at an ancient Egyptian phenomenon that may go back into, we don't know how early it actually goes back, because there are treatises ascribed to Hermes as early as the 3rd and 2nd century BCE, dealing with all sorts of topics native to Egyptian wisdom, and they're not in Greek. We start getting the Greek treatises in the Common Era, which is right around the birth of Christianity. But even those treatises are hard to date, and they have, we have the Byzantine collection, the Corpus Hermeticum, and then we have a large set of excerpts from Stobaeus, which I've translated. We've got a few Hermetic fragments that have been scrounged up in European libraries that are brand new. We've got the Coptic Hermetica now in Nag Hammadi, and all of these seem to be the products of, roughly, up to about the 6th century. And then, of course, there's a huge Hermetic reception, which is still going on today. So obviously Christian authors, Christian patristic authors start, facing off with Hermes, with Tertullian in late 2nd or early 3rd century. And he's a friend, he's a foe to some. He's something of a mixed character. He is somewhat like Paul, anything to anybody. But yeah, he's the master of all Egyptian lore, and it's simply Hermetism to me, and Justin, I'm sure, can add to this or change this, but it's just really, in the most broad sense, it's any phenomena, any text that ascribes itself, any practice that ascribes its wisdom to Hermes Thrice Great, which is that particular Egyptian sage, supposedly before the time of Moses, also somehow identified with the god Thoth or Thoth, if you will.
Yeah, I think that the only thing I would say much the same way and maybe slightly differently is that I think of Hermeticism as sort of two distinct branches of intellectual and technical and inheritance. The one branch is a spiritual technology. It's a soteriology. It's a theory of salvation that is primarily born in ancient Egypt and captured largely in the Corpus Hermeticum as we have it. And then there's a whole other body of literature, a technical Hermetica, although this is a modern distinction that I don't think ancient peoples didn't and wouldn't make on principled grounds, I think. And that literature is primarily concerned with other kinds of wisdom, which is also quasi-salvific in some ways, which would include things like astrology, alchemy, and a wide range of other technologies. So I would say that there's we can make a distinction as much as that distinction is artificial, and that would include the soteriological literature, but also the technical literature. And so I think that those two things are sort of wrapped up together, and now it's been explored all the way to the 20th century with things like the Kabbalion, which is a very polarizing and divisive text in some ways, but I guess from the philosophical point of view, if it calls itself Hermetic, then I'm going to, and people call it Hermetic, I'm going to have to anthropologically kind of group it in there, whether I think it should or shouldn't be. But yeah, as David said, there's literature that going back all the way into Demotic, things like the Demonic Book of Thoth, which is probably something like, Thothic literature. But a huge array of literature in this way, some of which is soteriological, some of which is technical.
Right, and then dealing with the Corpus Hermeticum itself, scholars usually agree, right, that these were written probably between the 1st and the 3rd centuries Common Era. And you touched upon it already, Dr. Sledge. This is a debate that's been going on for a while, how Greek or how Egyptian these elements in the Hermetica are. And, you have vastly different ideas about it. Like you have Festugier thought one thing, he's like, oh, there's nothing Egyptian in there at all. Then you have Fowden, who's like, no, it's, and Christian Bull recently, who are like, no, there's more Egyptian in there than, we probably thought in the past. So I would think it was safe to say that both of you fall in the camp that those elements are more Egyptian than they are just like Greek with little sprinklings of Egyptian kitsch on top.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
This
it's
is where
not a horse race, though.
Yeah, this is maybe where Dr. Litwa and I may disagree. I tend to be closer to Festugier, actually, in a lot of ways. Yeah, I tend to be the I'm gonna get myself canceled. I tend to see very little Egypt when I read the Demonic Book of Thoth and like the sort of what we have of the indigenous Egyptian literature. I see so little of that kind of temple literature in the Corpus Hermeticum. I think it's Egyptian. I think it's indigenous Egyptian people, maybe some people from the priest class. But I see it's just, I mean, I can say more about this maybe, but Wouter and I came to the same conclusion around the same time for very different reasons, Wouter Hanegraaff. But it to me strikes me as sort of practicalized middle Platonism in a lot of ways. So I see most of the Egyptian stuff as window dressing. I'm not impressed by Fowden's argument about how much Egyptian temple wisdom is making its way into those texts. But
right, yeah, it's I would say today, everyone should go read Christian Bull's book. But as I said before, it's not a horse race. I get New Testament scholars get into this trap, of Jew or Greek, and you can still get into this trap of Egyptian or Greek. And really, I don't think in antiquity we can work with those binary categories. Those are all overlapping categories, and the sources of identity, the springs of identity, are coming from both streams. I mean, I would say that definitely in the Hermetica that I translated, which is the Korikazmu and the tractates associated with the Korikazmu. I mean, it's very clear that these are Egyptian nationalists who are saying Egypt is the center of the world. The Greeks, they barely know how to speak. It's just sophistical, brouhaha, puff of smoke, logistical games, sophistical arguments. We have the true language. We speak in the language of the gods, as it were, and everything else is mumbo jumbo, and so the real wisdom is ours. So there's definitely that national element. But yeah, I mean, it's all ironical because all this stuff ends up in Greek.
And also they one of the criticisms, right, is they say that Greek lacks energeia, and there's no equivalent demonic. They're using Greek philosophical language to criticize the paucity of Greek. Like, there's no equivalent Egyptian term. It seems like it is a weird kind of argument. I think that it's an argument against the Greeks that relies on their very philosophy. They're using the master's tools to take the master's house apart.
Absolutely, and a great example is one might call it appropriation, but Iamblichus in De Mysteriis, or what's now called De Mysteriis, basically pretends to be an Egyptian priest, and he can pull this off. I mean, incredibly. I mean, you have to ask, how much, Egyptian literature did he read to be able to pull this off? But he pulls it off beautifully. Just pretends to be Abamon, the Egyptian priest. We're not even sure if Iamblichus ever went to Egypt, but he does a brilliant job pretending to be an Egyptian priest, speaking Egyptian wisdom, which is actually, I mean, his own rendition of it. And, I think the real question there is, in Iamblichus, is there anything really Egyptian in
right.
there?
And I wonder if an Egyptian priest, I mean, I don't know about you, Dr. Litwa. When I read the Demotic Book of Thoth for the first time, and when you actually read something written by Egyptian priests and you compare it to Iamblichus or the Corpus Hermeticum, to realize how wildly different they are as texts. And I agree with you that the distinction Greek and Egyptian at this time isn't a useful distinction. But I do wonder about indigenous Egyptian priestly wisdom versus Greek, the importation of Greek speculative philosophy. And I do think those are distinct strands of wisdom traditions that have a distinct language and distinct technical jargon and distinctive worldviews. And that's where I would want to where I'd want to wonder about the importation. It's not a distinction between Greek and Egyptian. It's a distinction between wisdom traditions. And where I would say I don't see much of the Egyptian wisdom tradition impressed upon the Corpus Hermeticum.
Yep.
That's what I'm not seeing. That's the distinction I would want to make.
And on the level of social history, I mean, one simply has to engage Christian Bull's argument that the writers of this material are, in fact, disenfranchised Egyptian priests. Mm-hmm. That has to be queried and questioned. I mean, it's a fantastic idea, but it has to be queried and questioned. The other thing, when we're dealing with distinct wisdom traditions, we need to think about abstract thought. I mean, human cultures think. I think Egyptians are just as capable of thinking abstractly. Mm-hmm. As the Greeks were, but they did so in different codes and right. modes. And, in the 20th century, there was this attempted distinction, and they also made it, for the Gnostics, unfortunately, but between mythological thinking and philosophical thinking. Right. But really, these are both equally abstract ways of thinking. Sure. And whether you're thinking about like the 8 original frogs of the cosmos, or, the shell of the turtle that rose out of the sea, or the God who cries and those tears become human beings. I mean, that's still abstract thought, right? It's not 57 aeons, one named virtue, one named love, one named human, one named church kind of tradition. But it's still they're still modes of abstract thought. They're just different modes of abstract mm-hmm. thought. And when you look at world mythologies, I mean, they're thinking on very at a very big, broad-based level. But yes, they have very different ways of phrasing, particularly creation traditions. And I think, it's an unfortunate fact of scientific discourse today, presents itself as the universalizing and best discourse. And really, this goes all the way back to the Greeks, who basically invented, the scientific treatise. And if you sound scientific, then
Right.
you're good. And that made these other cultures, the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Persians, who didn't have this scientific framing or this Greek epistemology, it made them seem like they were myth makers. But this is a very Western way of viewing it.
Right.
I think it's safer to say that there's just different modes and codes of abstract thought in a variety of cultures, and we can't get swept away by someone who says, "Well, the Greeks were scientific; they gave us science." Well, I mean, they
Right, and
certainly
that's funny
like the
because when
rhetoric.
of course, and it's funny, like when the Corpus Hermeticum wants to talk about creation, they rely neither on Greek speculation nor on Egyptian speculation. They rely on Jewish speculation. That's the most
Yep,
hilarious
partly.
part.
Yep.
Yeah, that's the only non-pagan source that the Corpus Hermeticum relies on, basically some version of the Genesis creation myth, because it seems like maybe the Jews had sort of the monopoly on that being the best creation method going at the time. So it's funny that, again, the eclecticism there in order to sound a certain kind of way, which again, it's funny to me that the same Egyptian nationalists that could have written the Asclepius are also happy to lean on the Jewish creation myth, the Israelite creation myth, and the Jews were terribly unpopular in some ways in Alexandria, both by the Romans and by the Egyptians. The Egyptians, destroyed that, their riots against the Jews in Alexandria and Elephantine Island and stuff like that. So it's just, the rhetoric matters in some ways. But at the end of the day, the Hermeticists are not interested in who they pull from. They're interested in a soteriological story of salvation. And I think that that's what, to them, at the end of the day, I think that many Neoplatonist philosophers, Numenius or whatever, who would have looked down their nose at the Corpus Hermeticum as the way that I think that people look down their nose at New Age spirituality now, sort of, watered down, silly, crystals and stuff. I think that many Neoplatonist philosophers in Alexandria would have looked at the Corpus Hermeticum and go, "This is just low rent, bad philosophy." But that's not what they were interested in. That wasn't the goal of what they were up to in the end.
And that's certainly what. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Dr. Litwa.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's certainly the attitude that Porphyry seems to have. Porphyry and Plotinus seem to have this very snooty attitude towards it. They don't really engage in it. You don't really see them engaging in things like that until somebody like Iamblichus comes along. They're more interested in things like the Chaldean oracles, strangely enough, which also takes from the same kind of sources. So who knows?
Well, I think it's worth noting, though, that certain Christian authors are genuinely concerned about Hermetic thought. I mean, Augustine begins to sweat in the 5th century, and he spends a lot of time trying to defeat what he considers to be Hermetic ideology in the Asclepius. If you've read The City of God, I think he's sweating enough. I mean, he takes it seriously enough to write in a very sophisticated critique. I mean, somewhat sophistical critique, but he's concerned. And yeah, I think, it's difficult to say, because Iamblichus, yes, Porphyry, yes, that he would have doubts about the Egyptian wisdom traditions, and he'd probably try to figure out if these were forgeries, knowing his bent, But Iamblichus is a great example of, yes, someone who is trying to take the material seriously. It has at least convinced himself that he's dealing with authentic, I think, Hermetic traditions, and is willing even to present himself as a Hermetist or an Egyptian priest. And the thing about dipping into Jewish tradition, I think that's a fascinating point, because Moses, I think a lot of Egyptians thought of Moses as an Egyptian, actually. So if a Hermetic thinker, I mean, the Exodus in Egypt, or the Moses story in Egypt, really began with Moses as Osarsif, or as an Egyptian priest who got leprosy and then led a bunch of rebels outside of Egypt. That was sort of their version of the Exodus in various manifestations. And there was, even on the part of the Jews like Artapanus, to present Moses as the Egyptian Hermes, that he was called Hermes, that he did a bunch of Hermetic style things. And so it's the Egyptians who are confused, because actually Hermes really is Moses. But then, I mean, is that really a critique? I mean, all this attempt at carving out your identity really ends up in a lot of mixed identities for these people. So whether, if an Egyptian priest or if a Hermeticist picks up Genesis, does he think or she think that it's a Jewish book? I mean, we would certainly ostensibly assume that. But if they think of Moses as the author, and if they think Moses is an Egyptian, maybe even some kind of, unfortunately leprous Egyptian priest, or I mean, we don't know exactly what they thought. Like this could be just another case of, we might call it appropriation, but if they viewed it as Egyptian, they would just take it as their own tradition, basically.
Interesting. This is fascinating. So I want to circle onto a slightly different subject, but also circling around to this concept of community. So in his quintessential book, The Middle Platonist, John Dillon coined this term, the Platonic underground. So when he's discussing Hermeticism, he kind of lumps it all together with things like the Greek magical papyri, Chaldean oracles, things like that. Gnostic movements, for lack of a better term. All of these things just seem to me like they're kind of moving in the same circles in very many senses. So I was wondering if we could kind of touch briefly upon the dynamic cultural exchange of things like Hermeticism, things like the Greek magical papyri, these practices Dr. Sledge was talking about, the technology of salvation, and, Sethian Gnostic movements within this cultural milieu. So, Dr. Sledge, did you want to start?
I mean, whatever they weren't underground. That's for sure. I mean, again, to Dr. Litwa's point, if Augustine feels the need to polемicize them, and Lactantius feels the need to claim them, we're not dealing with a situation where they're underground. That means that Christians are dealing with that means Christians in the 4th century or so are dealing with populations of people for whom this is a soteriological mode. Like, you can shop around. There's lots of ways to get salvation in the ancient Mediterranean world. This is a competition around soteriologies. And if Augustine over there in Hippo feels the need to polemicize against it, well, that just tells me that there are chunks of people, communities of people, thousands of people, that at some level, for whom this is a way of getting salvation, and therefore he has to argue against it. You don't argue against 4 weirdos in the desert of Alexandria. It just,
exactly.
I don't see that. So, I think these are communities. I tend to agree with Hanegraaff here. I think these are communities, and they're communities of salvation. And I would also put the Stoics and Epicureans and the skeptics. They're also part of this coping philosophy, trying to deal with the chaos of their world or whatever. And so, so I think that these are communities of people attempting to achieve salvation, much in the same way that the early Christian movement was, the apocalyptic Jewish movement was, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't like the term, Platonic underground, because it assumes that, if anyone's the underground, it's all these weird philosophers with their 3 students sitting around, talking to a handful of guys in this terribly technical language about, all the, the stuff that Plotinus goes on and on and on about, or, whatever, Proclus and things. That's the minority.
Right. That was what Fowden argued, right, with his with his thesis about the pagan holy man in antiquity. These people had very, very small circles, comparatively speaking. But with things like the Greek magical papyri or the Corpus Hermeticum, I mean, just the fact that they're so widely diffused,
Yeah, and the fact that
kind
we
of
find,
speaks to their popularity, don't you think?
yeah. I mean, Nagamati 6. When we find all these diverse sort of texts and translated into Coptic, you don't go through the work of translating stuff into Coptic, if no one's reading it or no one's using it or whatever. So, and that's just, Armenian, like this stuff ends up in Armenian and other kinds of things like that. It seems to me that these were populist ideas. And if you read, Plotinus is a little bit further downstream because I don't think he's quite there yet. But I think if you read some of these technical philosophical works, I don't think that they're accessible to popular teachings. It seems to me that the Hermeticum, texts like the Corpus Hermeticum or the Chaldean Oracles, less so because it's so strange. But in many ways, I see the Corpus Hermeticum as a popularized sort of new agey version of the soteriological theories that are popular in the day, and the Corpus Hermeticum gives them some degree of philosophical rigor, although that's not their primary interest. But I do think that this is not an underworld at all. I think this is just the world of practical spiritual technologies, of which there are dozens of these floating around the Mediterranean world.
Well, all I know is Platonic Underground is a great name for a band.
Yeah, I agree.
And
I agree.
Speaking of which, Dr. Sledge, you have some new merchandise out, don't you?
I do, yeah. It's funny because I borrowed the term from Richard Kiekeffer of the Clerical Necromantic Underground, which is just a fantastic metal band name. So this would be the Platonic Underground would just be the precursor to the Clerical Necromantic Underground of the 14th century.
Yeah, so, that's my industrial side project name.
Yeah, I think I had another one called Baroque Hypostatic Entities for all these. So yeah, I think that in the way that the Clerical Necromantic Underground was an actual underground, I think that is not true. I think Dylan unfortunately misuses that phrase and in his book on the Middle Platonists.
He speaks like a true classicist, and John Dillon is a dear soul, and a kind man. But yeah, that the classicist purview centralizes a certain subsection often of Greek tradition, and then when you have a focus, you also have a margin. Mm-hmm. And I think, calling something the Platonic underworld is a way to marginalize it, say that it's not the focus, it's not really what the 19th century British gentleman ought to be studying. It's something peripheral and weird, and in that sense, it's an esotericization of this material, which probably wasn't esoteric. I mean, at least in the circles that it originally cropped up in. So you end up just doing politics, whereas we should be doing the real job of scholarship and studying everything and taking seriously what this material has to say, regardless of where we think that it comes from.
Amazing.
Was there another part of your question there? I forgot it.
It doesn't matter.
Okay.
This is all great. Like, I love that it's just kind of going wherever you guys take it. So I'm going with the flow. But Dr. Litwa, I know you said you had to leave soon. So I'm going to leave you all with one final question, if that's okay. I'll keep this brief. So in academia, in terms of biblical scholarship, I know the concept of community nowadays is very controversial. A lot of our viewers are fans of Robin Faith Walsh and her criticism of the concept of like a Matthean community, or in the case of something like the Gospel of Thomas or the Thomas writings in the Nag Hammadi codices, like a Thomasine community. So are we kind of doing ourselves a disservice? I know we've kind of already touched upon this, but are we doing a disservice to the text by thinking of a Hermetic community, because we have all these, like, circling back to the beginning, we have radically different scenarios about what these texts were for. Whether, Reitzenstein or Fowden or Copenhaver, I know Copenhaver thinks they're more like private devotional texts that, you kind of, the holy word, that the sacrifice of the word. And then you have other people like Bull now who are more going towards, it's more of like a community, and Dr. Sledge believes it's, community. So to borrow a phrase from Earl at the Schwepp, thank you, Earl, for letting me use this phrase. What's your irresponsible speculation about these communities? What would you say they were like, if there was one?
Well, yeah, I think we need to be careful. And, Robin Faith Walsh has done a great service to scholarship with her book. But in a sense, it's low-hanging fruit to say that, texts don't mean communities, and communities don't always produce texts. And it's really against New Testament scholarship that she takes aim mostly in the irresponsible creation of communities from the study of texts. It partially goes back to church tradition, where you see, these texts as representing church groups with, particular themes and emphases, rather than the private musings of the author. And that's very good. But on the other hand, you can throw the baby out with the bathwater, because if you just drop this loaded term, if you want to call it romantic, that's fine, community, which it's really Stan Stowers, who's Robin's teacher, who in an article on the concept of community said, this term is just overloaded and overladen with romantic ideals of like a close-knit fellowship and unity of mind, and those assumptions need to be eliminated. But I think it's perfectly fun to talk about groups in a neutral sense. And of course, sociologists have been talking about social identity and group identity for decades. And yes, you can see the dynamics of social identity and group identity working out in texts. I think responsible scholars can still say, okay, well, this text is talking about prayer at evening, at morning, face toward the sun, toward the east, at a certain time with certain words, talking about a certain meditation practice, or talking about a certain eating practice. Why wouldn't we think that this is the mechanics of group identity? And no one can slap us on the wrist and say, well, no, you can't move from text to community. Well, you can if you do so responsibly. And if we just talk in the more neutral sense of groups, yes, I think that Hermetic groups, there probably were something like Hermetic groups. Did they have a unity of mind? Were they close-knit, spiritual fellowship? Maybe not. I'm also very happy with the audience cults. Because when you have just group, the group can be variously conceived and defined. Is it a group of readers going to book club? Is it people actually going to some secret cave at midnight on a Tuesday? Slitting a cat's throat or something. God help us. Is it something else? What's the firmness of the group's identity? Maybe a text can't tell us that. So let's unload this term and talk more, and maybe more sociologically sophisticated, in a more sophisticated sense, about what kind of group identity we have here with the so-called Hermetists.
Dr. Sledge?
I guess I'm not a sociologist or anthropologist, but when I read the literature that survives, what I see are group identity markers, like the Asclepius, like the Greeks are bad. That's like a negative identity marker. That's sort of like we are not them, and that tells me that they're identifying as something other. Also, we have some ritual practice that seems to survive in these Hermetic texts, like some kind of, rituals tend not to be things you do on your own. They tend to be things that are done in communal settings. We have the phrase "way of Hermes" that tends to strike me as that when you say you're on the way of Hermes, it tends to be an exclusionary term, that you're on this way and not some other way. They strike me as a community. And again, I think that when I see Augustine polemicize against them, or like Tantra's claim them, or when I see other texts like the Prayer of Thanksgiving, or the what seems to be a kind of initiatory text on the discourse of the 8th and the 9th, this looks like the remnants, And again, I think Dr. Litt was right. We have to be careful. But if I were a betting man and you ask for not so responsible speculation, I'm going to say that there were groups of people out there, and I think not just groups of people, but I think people for whom this was an identity, this was a spiritual practice, this was a coherentizing narrative for their world, and I think they must have been significant in number, because I always, the survival bias is what it is. We can never be clear about what manuscripts survive versus what to what degree that's a reflection of what actually existed on the ground. But it is surprising to me how much of this literature survives, and that tells me at some level that what we have is a shadow of what was lost. And I suspect that this was a spiritual vocation for a community of people in Alexandria and beyond. And so in that way, I do think we can talk about a community. And in the same way that I think that maybe the layer of resolution is wrong here, like talking about a Thomas community or a Matthean community or a Johannine community, I'm not so sure about that. I think that criticism I get, but talking about a Christian community, sure, like that existed. And the same way, I think that we should talk about that in the way of Hermes. There was a Hermetic community, and there may have been disagreement, even within the Corpus Hermeticum. There are technical disagreements about things. Some texts are more dualistic, some texts are not. But I don't think it's beyond dispute there was a Christian community or whatever. And in the same way that to think that there was a Hermetic community of which there were actually rival positions, that seems very likely to me. Again, the Corpus Hermeticum seems to betray that. They're not internally logically coherent. Not that that's their end goal anyway.
Right.
But
you
in that
and
way,
I are going to be talking about poimandres, and I didn't mean to interrupt, but just we're going to be talking about poimandres, and I see it as a very positive view of the world. But then you have other texts in the Corpus Hermeticum that are very have a less positive, more negative view of the world. So, right. like you said, they're very inconsistent in terms of the worldview.
And that's just that to me also is again the classic the Jew on the desert island, right? That the Jew builds 2 synagogues. I think that kind of contradiction tells me that there's a community there, because communities struggle over ideas, and the fact that the Corpus Hermeticum remembers that struggle, that there are different positions at work. That to me tells me that there's some level of intellectual discourse happening, and that discourse typically is sort of pyramidal, right? That's the tip of it, and there's a much more larger population base beneath it that's engaging in that. Which I love the idea of, like the more dualist and the less dualist Hermeticists like arguing each other about whatever, and that's all been lost to us. But I suspect it probably happened.
And to
it's
respect
like Sorry, Dr. Lou. I keep interrupting y'all. I'm like, I'm so sorry. I know. I'm just going to bring up it's like the gospel of the testimony of truth, right? Who do we think wrote that? Dr. Litwa? Some scholars think that Julius Africanus wrote that. It was like just the other Valentinians just weren't hardcore enough for them. So it's like the same thing going on there, So
the narcissism of minor difference, Freud called it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
to
respect Robin's point, and then I should probably go, I think we need to think more. The reason why I'm skeptical of community as opposed to group is I think we need to think in terms of literate religious experts who are individuals. Very few people wrote in the ancient world. Very few people read, and even fewer people wrote. So what we have as the product that's left behind are the manuscripts of literate intellectuals, and they don't represent the people on the bottom of the pyramid, which, as Justin explained it, and when we're thinking about debates, I think we're mostly thinking of, in my view, debates between individual literate religious experts who may or may not have led groups, and the people in their groups may or may not have agreed with their teacher. I mean, it's as if a pastor of a church wrote a treatise that survived 2,000 years from now. I mean, we shouldn't read that treatise as representing what everyone in the church thought. I mean, that could be 500 people or more. It's the literate expert who's giving the sermon. That's where we're getting the snapshot from. And so that's, obviously he's dialoguing and in interaction with everybody else, but he's not representing them in any official sense. And, the last minor point is, I mean, it's always worth noting that, yes, we can posit groups, but all that survives, to my knowledge anyway, are the texts themselves. So we don't have things that we might have for other Christians. So we don't have remnants of Hermetic buildings or artifacts or any kind of archaeology which we could do that would point toward distinctly Hermetic groups. And as far as I know, we also don't have anyone in antiquity, correct me if I'm wrong, Justin, just outright saying, I am a Hermetist.
Ludovico Lazzarelli is the first person to call themselves that.
Okay, excellent. Well, this is a great example of your knowledge exceeding mine. But yeah, it goes to show that, we always have to be careful, and that's the mark of scholarship. And I would rather talk about concrete social realities on the ground, and individuals proposing ideas, rather than talking about like close knit, groups of 30 or 40 people. Same thing with the New Testament. Paul writes the letter to the First Corinthians. I don't think any of the Corinthians actually agreed with Paul. I mean, but he gets to be the representative, the unrepresentative representative of what was going on in Corinth, in the early 50s. So, anywho, thank you so much. I really appreciate, Jason, you having me on, and Justin, meeting you. And I hope this is just the beginning of many, many meetings on this platform and on other platforms. And I am dearly sorry, but I'm headed off to a Coptic lesson. So
on this Patreon, people. So go join Dr. Litwa's Patreon and Dr. Sledge's Patreon.
Appreciate that. Yeah.
Well worth it.
So yeah, someone is making use of my time and talents, which I am so glad to offer. And I know Justin is doing probably a whole lot more. So anyway, I will sign off and just thank you both.
Awesome. Dr. Sledge, Dr. Litwa, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you both.